A girl shared her last meal with a stranger, and in that single moment of pure compassion, everything changed forever. When Maria's world had been stripped down to nothing but a single piece of bread, she made a choice that would rewrite her entire destiny. Poverty had crushed her spirit, but her humanity remained unbroken. Little did she know, her single act of selflessness was about to trigger a chain of events that would shock everyone. The wind howled through the cracked walls of Maria's tiny one-room shelter, a cruel symphony of desperation that matched the emptiness in her stomach. 12 days had passed since her last full meal. 12 endless days of watching her younger siblings' eyes grow duller with each passing hour. The wooden floorboards, weathered and splintered, creaked with every movement, a constant reminder of their deteriorating existence. Her mother, Elena Rodriguez, once the strongest woman in their small mountain village, now sat in the corner like a fragile shadow. Her once robust hands, which had worked fields and mended clothes with incredible skill, now trembled uncontrollably. Years of hard labor and recent months of starvation had stripped away her vitality, leaving behind a shell of a woman who had once been the heart of their family. Maria's younger siblings, Elena, just 6 years old, and Miguel, barely 9, huddled together on a thin, moth-eaten blanket. Their clothes hung loose on their skeletal frames, a tragic testament to the weeks of malnutrition. Miguel would occasionally look up at Maria with eyes that seemed too old, too knowing for a child his age. Those eyes held a mixture of hope and resignation that broke her heart every single time. The textile factory where Maria used to work had closed abruptly 3 months ago, a casualty of economic downturn and corporate indifference. Hundreds of workers, mostly women and young adults from families like hers, were suddenly cast into a merciless unemployment landscape. The factory owner, a wealthy man from the city, had simply packed up and left, leaving behind a community gutted of its primary economic lifeline. Her father's memory was more than just a distant recollection. It was an open wound. Juan Rodriguez had died 2 years earlier in a horrific industrial accident at the local mining site. No compensation, no acknowledgement, just a brief note and a cold dismissal. His death had been the first domino in their family's slow, agonizing descent into poverty. Maria's fingers traced the last remaining coins in her pocket. 3 rusted centavos, a testament to how far they had fallen. Each coin represented a fragment of hope, a potential meal, a momentary reprieve from the constant gnawing hunger. But she knew these coins were more symbolic than practical. In this economy, in this moment, they were practically worthless. The evening light filtered through the broken window, casting long skeletal shadows across their single room. Dust particles danced in, the fading sunlight, a silent ballet of despair. Maria's gaze swept across the room. The cracked walls, the single wooden chair with a missing leg, the small kerosene lamp that had seen better days. Everything spoke of their struggle, their resilience, their impending collapse. Elena, her youngest sister, hadn't cried in days, and that silence was more terrifying than any sound. Children always cry when they're hungry, when they're scared. But Elena's silence was different. A profound, soul-deep quiet that suggested an understanding no 6-year-old should ever possess. It was a silence of acceptance, of resignation. As night began to fall, Maria made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would find a way. Pride, fear, exhaustion, none of these would matter. She would walk miles. She would beg. She would do anything to bring food home. Survival was no longer a choice. It was their only language, their only hope. In that moment, as darkness enveloped their small, broken shelter, Maria Rodriguez transformed. No longer just a young woman trying to survive, she became a warrior, a protector, the sole beacon of hope for her family. The pre-dawn streets of San Miguel were a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, where secrets seemed to cling to the weathered stone walls and narrow alleyways. Maria moved like a phantom, her thin frame casting elongated silhouettes that danced against the cobblestone pathways. The air was thick with morning mist, a delicate veil that carried the faint scent of wood smoke, distant hope, and the lingering memories of countless mornings just like this one. Her worn leather shoes, inherited from her mother years ago, were more than mere footwear. They were a family heirloom of survival. Each step made soft, almost imperceptible sounds against the uneven ground. A careful negotiation between caution and raw determination. The shoes were scuffed and faded, their leather cracked like the lines of an ancient map, telling stories of journeys taken and hardships endured. She had left home before the first whisper of dawn, while her mother and siblings still slept in the fragile peace of early morning. The memory of Elena's shallow breathing and Miguel's restless movements haunted her with every step she took. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, heavier than any physical burden she had ever carried. It was a weight composed of intricate layers: responsibility, fear, hope, and an almost desperate love that defied rational explanation. The world around her was a tapestry of potential. The marketplace with its promise of daily labor, the distant city center whispering of unknown opportunities, the farmlands on the outskirts suggesting a different kind of hope. Each path was a delicate dance of risk and possibility. Each potential choice a gamble that could mean survival or complete defeat for her family. In San Miguel, hope was a currency more precious than money, more sustaining than bread. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky in muted oranges and soft, melancholic grays, Maria approached the central plaza. The town was slowly awakening, transforming from a sleeping entity into a living, breathing organism. Vendors moved with practiced efficiency, setting up their stalls with a rhythm that spoke of countless mornings just like this one. The metallic clang of pots and pans created a percussion section to the morning symphony, accompanied by the distant bark of street dogs and the tentative chirping of sparrows testing the day's first light. Laborers gathered in clusters along the plaza's edges, human constellations of desperation and resilience. They were a living testament to the town's economic struggle, each body telling silent stories of hard work, harder times, and the unbreakable spirit of survival. An older man with skin like carefully aged leather stood apart from the groups, his eyes holding decades of unspoken wisdom. When he noticed Maria, something in his gaze shifted, a mixture of concern, recognition, and a profound understanding that transcended words. "You're too young," he muttered, not with dismissal, but with a strange, gentle warning. His voice was rough, like gravel mixed with compassion. Maria met his gaze without flinching. Her response was simple yet profound, each word carefully chosen. "Home is where survival begins." In that moment, she was more than a young woman seeking work. She was a living embodiment of resilience, a guardian whose love knew no boundaries. Her fingers unconsciously brushed against the 3 centavos in her pocket, a small metallic reminder of their family's precarious existence. These coins were more than currency. They were fragments of hope, potential lifelines, symbols of the razor-thin margin between existence and complete despair. Each coin carried the weight of their collective struggle, tiny metallic witnesses to their journey. The marketplace began to pulse with a brutal, almost living energy. Here, human worth was not measured by dreams or potential, but by daily wages and physical capability. Negotiations happened in rapid-fire exchanges, bodies were appraised like commodities, and hope was a currency more volatile than gold. Maria observed this intricate dance, her young mind calculating, strategizing, preparing to fight for her family's survival. In that suspended moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The morning light caught the edges of Maria's determined profile, casting her in a light that was both fragile and fierce. She was a daughter, a sister, a provider, a beacon of hope standing at the crossroads of possibility. The morning's initial promise of opportunity began to solidify into something more tangible as Maria positioned herself near the edge of the marketplace. Her observant eyes, deep brown and impossibly alert, scanned the growing crowd, watching the intricate dance of laborers seeking work and employers making their selections. The marketplace was a living, breathing organism of human desperation and hope. Each person a potential thread in the complex tapestry of survival. San Miguel's morning light was unforgiving, stripping away pretenses and revealing the raw edges of human struggle. Dust particles danced in the air, catching the sunlight and creating a shimmering veil that seemed to separate reality from possibility. The cobblestone plaza, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, held its own silent memories of countless mornings just like this one. A sudden commotion near the western edge of the plaza caught her attention. Two men were arguing, one older, weathered, clearly a local farmer with skin the color of sun-baked leather, the other younger and dressed in clothing that suggested he was not from San Miguel. Their voices rose and fell, creating a tension that made nearby workers take subtle steps away, creating an impromptu circle of unspoken drama. "I need workers who understand the land," the farmer was saying, his voice rough with frustration and years of hard labor. "Not city boys who think farming is some romantic adventure. This isn't a game. This is survival." His hands, marked with calluses and old scars, gestured emphatically, telling their own story of decades of physical struggle. The younger man, clearly an outsider with soft hands and a city-bred demeanor, seemed determined. His pressed trousers and slightly wrinkled shirt spoke of recent financial decline. His hands were too smooth, his posture too rigid, betraying a life far removed from physical labor. Yet something in his demeanor suggested a desperation that mirrored Maria's own, a hunger that went beyond mere employment, a need that spoke of deeper, more complex survival. As the argument continued, Maria found herself inching closer, not to interfere, but to listen. Information was often more valuable than coins in a place like San Miguel. Every conversation could be a potential opportunity, every overheard word a possible pathway to survival. Her mother's lessons echoed in her mind. Knowledge was a weapon more powerful than any physical strength. The farmer's frustration was now a tangible thing, filling the space around them. 3 workers quit last week. The harvest cannot wait. The land does not care about your personal problems or city schedules. His hand gestured toward the distant fields, where rows of crops stretched like undulating green waves against the morning landscape. Those fields were more than just land. They were a lifeline, a delicate ecosystem of survival that demanded constant attention and respect. Maria observed the dynamics with a maturity that belied her years. The farmer was practical, driven by immediate needs. The city man was desperate, driven by circumstances beyond his control. And in their conflict, she saw an opportunity, a potential bridge between their opposing needs. Her ears pricked up at the mention of needed workers. Opportunity was presenting itself, subtle and unexpected, like a whispered promise carried on the morning breeze. The marketplace around her continued its chaotic rhythm. vendors calling out, laborers positioning themselves. The constant negotiation of human worth measured in daily wages and physical capability. The young man, who seemed barely older than Maria herself, looked defeated. His city clothes were already showing signs of dust and desperation, the pristine fabric telling a story of recent misfortune. Something in his stance spoke of dreams that had crumbled somewhere between ambition and reality, of expectations crushed by the harsh mechanics of economic survival. In that moment, Maria understood something profound about survival. It wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about adaptability, about seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles, about transforming limitations into possibilities. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Watch, listen, understand before you act. Words that had been hammered into her since childhood, words that now seemed like a strategic blueprint for survival. They were more than advice. They were a survival manual written in the language of resilience. The farmer was about to walk away, his patience exhausted, when Maria took a step forward. Her movement was deliberate, her posture suggesting a confidence that belied her years. Each step was calculated, each breath measured. "Señor," she called out, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the morning's ambient noise. Both the farmer and the young city man turned, surprised by the unexpected interruption. Their faces, one weathered, one soft, reflected a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation. The day was just beginning, and already it promised to be anything but ordinary. The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this unexpected encounter would unfold. The marketplace around them continued its rhythmic dance, a living, breathing ecosystem of human ambition and survival. Vendors called out their wares, laborers shuffled and repositioned themselves, and the morning light cast long shadows that seemed to hold their own silent narratives. Rodrigo Sanchez, a man whose very posture told stories of decades wrestling with unforgiving land, studied Maria and Eduardo with the same intense scrutiny he would use to examine a potentially problematic crop. His hands, mapped with decades of scars and calluses, rested on his weathered belt, a silent punctuation to his internal deliberations. The economic landscape of San Miguel was changing, a subtle but relentless transformation that was pushing traditional agricultural communities to their limits. Younger generations were abandoning farmlands for urban promises, leaving behind a growing void that threatened the region's fundamental agricultural infrastructure. "Tell me," Rodrigo said, his voice a gravelly instrument of curiosity, "what makes you think you can help me with the harvest?" Maria's response was immediate, her words carefully chosen. "My family has worked these lands for 3 generations. We understand that farming is not just about physical labor, but about understanding the land's rhythm, its subtle language." Eduardo watched, fascinated. His urban background had distanced him from such raw, practical knowledge. Here was a young woman who spoke about agriculture with the same reverent city professionals might discuss complex financial strategies. Rodrigo's eyes narrowed, calculating. The upcoming harvest was critical, a potential make-or-break season for his family's farm. Local workers were becoming increasingly scarce, drawn away by factory jobs and urban opportunities. Each passing season felt like a battle against economic forces far larger than his individual struggle. "My fields cover 30 hectares, he explained, more to himself than to his unexpected audience. "Mainly corn and beans. This year's crop is particularly sensitive. The recent weather patterns have been unpredictable." Maria nodded, her understanding evident. "The northern section near the river will need extra attention. The soil there retains more moisture, which can lead to fungal issues if not managed correctly. Eduardo was stunned. This young woman spoke with a technical precision that belied her years. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was deeply practical, rooted in generations of lived experience. Rodrigo's skepticism began to transform. Here, in this dusty marketplace, stood two potential solutions to his labor challenges. Maria, young, knowledgeable, connected to the land. Eduardo, educated, potentially capable of managing the administrative complexities of modern farming. And you? He turned to Eduardo. What brings a city man to our agricultural region? Eduardo's story spilled out, a narrative of economic displacement. A mid-level accountant recently laid off, his urban skills suddenly feeling obsolete in a rapidly changing job market. The economic downturn had stripped away his professional identity, leaving him searching for purpose. I can manage records, track expenses, help with financial planning, he offered, his voice a mixture of desperation and hope. The marketplace around them seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. This was more than a potential job negotiation. It was a microcosm of larger economic shifts, of traditional systems adapting to new realities. Maria watched, her observant eyes tracking the subtle interactions. She understood something profound. Survival was about collaboration, about finding unexpected connections in moments of apparent crisis. Rodrigo's weathered face slowly transformed. The hard lines softened, revealing a glimpse of a man who had spent decades fighting not just agricultural challenges, but the broader economic forces threatening his way of life. Come, he said finally, a decision crystallizing. Let's discuss this over coffee. The morning is young, and we have much to talk about. The cafe was a modest establishment tucked away in a narrow alley, its weathered wooden door bearing the patina of decades. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of strong coffee and the whispered conversations of countless morning negotiations. The walls, painted a faded ochre, held photographs of San Miguel's past. Black and white images of harvests, family gatherings, and the slow march of time. Vintage posters advertising long-defunct agricultural products lined the shelves, silent witnesses to the region's evolving economic landscape. Rodrigo led them to a corner table, away from the main flow of customers. An elderly woman emerged from behind the counter, her face breaking into a warm smile upon seeing the farmer. Her name was Doña Carmen, and she had been serving coffee in this establishment for 43 years, watching generations of San Miguel's residents negotiate their lives over steaming cups. Rodrigo, the usual? She asked, already moving toward the coffee station with practiced efficiency. 3 coffees, Carmen, he replied, then paused, his weathered features softening. And bring some pan dulce. We have important discussions ahead. The cafe became their temporary sanctuary, a neutral ground where different worlds could collide and potentially merge. Maria sat across from Rodrigo, her posture straight despite her weariness. She had learned early in life to present strength even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Eduardo positioned himself at an angle, still somewhat uncertain of his place in this emerging arrangement, his fingers drumming nervously against the table's worn surface. The cafe's interior told stories in its own language. The counter was crafted from dark wood, polished smooth by decades of elbows and hands. Behind it, shelves held an eclectic collection of cups, each one bearing different designs, different eras. Some were pristine, clearly rarely used. Others showed the wear of constant service, their handles smoothed by thousands of hands, their surfaces bearing the faint stains of countless cups of coffee. Doña Carmen returned with the coffee, setting each cup down with ceremonial care. The coffee itself was a work of art, dark as midnight, with a thin layer of foam on top, releasing wisps of aromatic steam that carried the essence of roasted beans and possibility. She also placed a basket of pan dulce on the table, the sweet bread still warm from the kitchen, its sugar-dusted surface glinting in the morning light, filtering through the cafe's narrow windows. "Enjoy, my friends," Carmen said warmly, then retreated to give them privacy, though her protective presence remained, watching over them like a guardian of important conversations. Rodrigo wrapped his weathered hands around the cup, as if drawing warmth and clarity from its heat. The gesture was almost ritualistic, a moment of contemplation before entering into serious discussion. His hands told their own story. Decades of agricultural labor had written itself into every callus, every scar, every weathered line. "Let me be direct," Rodrigo began, his voice carrying the weight of practical experience and hard-won wisdom. "I need workers for the harvest. It will be demanding work. Long hours, physical exhaustion, challenges you cannot imagine until you experience them firsthand." Maria nodded, absorbing his words with the seriousness they deserved. She understood labor in its most fundamental form, not as abstract concept, but as lived reality. Her family had been working fields for generations, and she had inherited not just their physical capabilities, but their mental resilience. "The harvest season lasts approximately 3 months," Rodrigo continued, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "During peak periods, we work from dawn until sunset, sometimes beyond if weather conditions threaten the crop. The work involves harvesting, sorting, preparing crops for market. It requires precision, strength, and an understanding that mistakes can mean financial ruin." He paused, allowing his words to settle, to sink into their consciousness. This was not a casual employment opportunity. This was a commitment to something larger than themselves. Eduardo listened intently, his analytical mind already calculating the logistics, the financial implications, the practical arrangements. His recent unemployment had taught him to think in terms of systems and structures. "What about housing, food, compensation structure? Are there contracts, insurance considerations?" Rodrigo's eyes flickered with appreciation. Here was someone thinking systematically about the practical arrangements. Someone trained in the language of modern employment structures. "I have workers' quarters on the property," he explained, gesturing as if the farm existed just beyond the cafe walls. "Basic but adequate. Clean, with beds and simple furnishings. Food is provided. We eat well during harvest season because the work demands it. My wife, Isabella, oversees the kitchen. She understands that workers performing physical labor need substantial nutrition." He took another sip of coffee, his expression becoming more contemplative. "Compensation is by the day, plus a bonus if we exceed our harvest targets. I pay fairly, better than many other farms in the region. I believe that workers who are well-fed and fairly compensated work more efficiently. It's not charity, it's practical economics." Maria leaned forward, her keen mind already grasping the complexities. "What about the challenges you mentioned? The unpredictable weather patterns? How do they affect the work schedule?" Rodrigo's expression grew more serious, the lines around his eyes deepening. "This year has been particularly difficult. The rains came late, 3 weeks behind schedule, which delayed planting. Then when the rains came, they came too heavily. Some sections of the northern fields experienced flooding. We're racing against time to salvage what we can before further deterioration occurs." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the distant hills. His silhouette against the light seemed to embody the weight of responsibility he carried. The climate is becoming increasingly unpredictable, he continued. My father could predict the weather patterns with remarkable accuracy. He understood the land's language. But that language seems to be changing. What worked for decades no longer applies. The conversation deepened, moving beyond simple employment negotiation into territory that suggested genuine partnership. Rodrigo found himself explaining not just what needed to be done, but why it mattered. The farm wasn't merely a business. It was a legacy, a connection to generations of family history. My grandfather purchased this land 70 years ago, Rodrigo said, returning to the table, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral responsibility. During the economic crisis of 1954, he paid almost nothing. The land was considered marginal, difficult to work. But he understood something that others didn't. He saw potential. He paused, lost in memory for a moment. My grandfather worked that land for 50 years. He built irrigation systems with his own hands. He planted trees that now provide shade and wind protection. He transformed marginal land into productive agricultural property. My father continued his work, expanding the operation, introducing new crops, adapting to changing markets. Rodrigo's voice grew quieter, more introspective. And now it's my responsibility to maintain that legacy. But the world is changing faster than I can adapt. Land values are rising, agricultural profits are declining, the economic forces reshaping our region are beyond individual control. The stakes suddenly became crystal clear. This wasn't about temporary employment. It was about preserving a way of life threatened by larger economic forces. Eduardo's perspective shifted dramatically. His recent unemployment suddenly felt less personal, more connected to broader patterns of economic transformation affecting entire regions and generations. You're facing pressure from developers? Constant pressure, Rodrigo admitted, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone fighting an unwinnable battle. Land values have increased dramatically. Developers want to convert agricultural areas into residential complexes. The financial pressure is relentless. They send representatives regularly, offering increasingly attractive prices. Each year the offers increase. Each year it becomes harder to refuse. He pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket pocket, extracting a letter. The paper was creased from repeated folding and unfolding. This arrived last month. A development company offering 3 times what the land was worth 5 years ago. They're patient, they're persistent, and they understand that economic pressure eventually breaks even the most determined resistance. Maria understood something deeper in this moment. Survival wasn't individual, it was collective. Her own family's struggles were echoed in Rodrigo's predicament. The economic forces reshaping their region affected everyone, just in different ways. If you sell, what happens to you? She asked, her question cutting to the heart of the matter. Rodrigo smiled sadly. That's the question I ask myself every night. I'm 58 years old. I've never done anything except farm. My education is limited. My skills are specific to agricultural work. If I sell, I become another displaced farmer, another victim of economic transformation. Eduardo recognized the pattern. He had seen similar dynamics in the city, workers displaced by technological change, by economic restructuring, by forces larger than individual capability. So this harvest is critical, Eduardo said, understanding crystallizing. A successful harvest could provide enough income to sustain the farm for another year. A failed harvest might force you to sell. Exactly, Rodrigo confirmed. This harvest will determine whether we can maintain the property or whether we'll be forced to sell to developers. It's that simple. and that devastating. Doña Carmen approached the table again, refilling their coffee cups without being asked. She clearly understood the gravity of the conversation, the weight of the moment. Her movements were gentle, respectful, as if she were performing a sacred ritual. "The harvest will be successful," she said quietly, with the certainty of someone who had witnessed many such moments. "I can feel it. Sometimes the universe provides what we need, exactly when we need it most." Rodrigo smiled gratefully at the elderly woman, drawing comfort from her words and her presence. Maria studied the farmer more carefully now. She saw not just a man facing economic crisis, but a representative of an entire way of life under siege. She understood that her decision to help extended beyond simple employment. It was a statement about values, about resistance to dehumanizing economic forces. "When do we start?" Maria asked, her decision crystallizing into absolute certainty. "I'm ready to begin immediately." Rodrigo looked at her, then at Eduardo. "You're both willing? You understand what you're committing to?" Eduardo nodded slowly, understanding that this opportunity represented more than employment. It was a chance at redemption, at finding purpose beyond the urban economic systems that had discarded him. It was an opportunity to contribute to something meaningful, something connected to human survival and dignity. "I'm willing," Eduardo confirmed. "I need this as much as you need me." Rodrigo's expression softened. "We start tomorrow, before dawn. Bring sturdy clothes, strong shoes, and prepare yourself mentally for the most demanding work you've likely experienced." He pulled out a worn notebook and began writing down details. The address of the farm, specific instructions for arrival, what to bring, what to expect. His handwriting was careful, deliberate, each letter precisely formed despite his weathered hands. "The work will be difficult," he warned again, "but it will also be meaningful. You'll be part of something important, the preservation of a way of life, the maintenance of a legacy, the resistance against forces that seek to reduce everything to commercial value." The cafe around them seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. This was more than a potential job negotiation. It was a microcosm of larger economic shifts, of traditional systems adapting to new realities, of individuals finding unexpected connections in moments of apparent crisis. Doña Carmen smiled knowingly from behind her counter, as if she understood the significance of the moment unfolding before her. In San Miguel, such moments happened regularly. Desperate people finding unexpected connections, forming alliances born from mutual need and shared struggle. But they were never ordinary. They were always sacred in their own way. The alarm on Eduardo's borrowed phone buzzed at 4:47 a.m., pulling him from a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams about fields and failure. He had spent the previous evening preparing, laying out clothes, reviewing the farm's location on a digital map, mentally rehearsing what he imagined the work would entail. None of his mental preparation could have adequately prepared him for the reality of what awaited. The darkness outside was absolute, a thickness that seemed to have weight and substance. It pressed against the windows of the boarding house room like a living entity, suffocating in its completeness. Eduardo had grown accustomed to urban darkness. The ambient light of street lamps, the glow of neon signs, the illumination of passing vehicles. This rural darkness was different, more primal, more honest in its refusal to acknowledge human presence. He dressed quickly in the modest room where he had been staying since his arrival in San Miguel. The space was sparse, a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small table holding a pitcher and basin for washing. The walls were painted a pale blue, faded by years of exposure to sunlight and the passage of countless temporary residents. The room smelled of lime and dust, a scent that had initially seemed foreign but was becoming increasingly familiar. The clothes felt stiff and unfamiliar. Work pants he had purchased at a local market for a price that seemed simultaneously reasonable and expensive given his current financial circumstances. A heavy cotton shirt that still bore the creases from its original packaging. Boots that had cost more than he wanted to spend, but which the vendor had insisted were necessary for serious farm work. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. The man in the reflection seemed simultaneously older and younger than his actual age, as if the weight of recent unemployment and current uncertainty had aged him, while the prospect of meaningful work had restored some youthful vitality. The walk to Rodrigo's farm took 40 minutes through pre-dawn darkness. Eduardo had mapped the route the previous afternoon, walking it in daylight to ensure he wouldn't become lost in the darkness. The streets of San Miguel gradually transformed from urban density to rural landscape. Streetlights gave way to starlight. The sound of vehicles faded into the symphony of nocturnal creatures. Crickets whose rhythmic chirping created a hypnotic soundscape. Frogs calling from unseen water sources, the distant call of roosters responding to an internal clock that preceded human alarm systems by hours. The air changed as well. In the city, it carried the scent of exhaust and human habitation. Here, it smelled of earth and growing things, of moisture and decay, of life in all its complex manifestations. Eduardo found the smell strangely comforting, as if his body recognized something his conscious mind had forgotten, a primal connection to natural cycles and agricultural rhythms. When Eduardo reached the farm's entrance, marked by a weathered wooden gate bearing the faded name Rancho Sanchez, painted in letters that had been refreshed multiple times over the decades, he found Maria already there. She was sitting on a low stone wall, her silhouette barely visible against the pre-dawn darkness. The wall itself was constructed from stones gathered from the surrounding landscape, fitted together with a kind of patient precision that suggested it had been built gradually, over years, perhaps even decades. Maria had been waiting for at least 20 minutes, having walked even farther than Eduardo to arrive at this appointed moment. Her face, as it gradually became visible in the increasing pre-dawn light, showed no sign of fatigue or doubt. Instead, there was a kind of calm determination, as if she had made peace with whatever challenges awaited. "You came," Maria said simply, as if she had harbored some doubt about his commitment despite his apparent enthusiasm during their conversation with Rodrigo. "Of course," Eduardo replied, though his voice carried uncertainty beneath the surface bravado. "Did you doubt I would?" "People doubt themselves in the darkness," Maria responded philosophically, her words carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom, especially when facing the unknown. I wanted to make sure at least one of us was certain. There was something in her tone that suggested she had learned this lesson through personal experience, through witnessing her own doubts and the doubts of others in moments of critical decision-making. Before Eduardo could respond with further conversation, a light appeared in the distance. Rodrigo emerging from the farmhouse, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the landscape. The light seemed almost supernatural in its effect, transforming the familiar darkness into a landscape of shifting shapes and mysterious shadows. Rodrigo moved with the confidence of someone who had traversed this path countless times, his footsteps sure and deliberate. He was already dressed for work, his movements efficient and purposeful despite the early hour. His clothes were worn but well maintained, bearing the patina of years of agricultural labor. His boots were scuffed and creased, molded to the shape of his feet by years of consistent use. He wore a hat that had faded from its original color to a pale tan, the brim creased from years of being held in his hand during moments of contemplation. "Good," he said, approaching them with the lantern held before him. "You're both here. This is important. Punctuality demonstrates commitment. Commitment determines whether we succeed or fail." His words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. They were a test, an assessment of character, a measurement of whether these two urban displaced individuals possessed the discipline necessary for agricultural labor. Behind Rodrigo, the farmhouse began to reveal itself as the sky lightened incrementally. It was a substantial structure, built decades ago with practical rather than aesthetic considerations. The walls were whitewashed, though the paint was peeling in places, revealing the adobe brick beneath. The roof was covered in terracotta tiles that had weathered countless seasons, their surface dulled by exposure to sun and rain, some cracked or missing entirely, requiring periodic replacement. The farmhouse appeared to have been expanded multiple times over its history. The central structure was clearly the oldest, probably dating back 60 or 70 years. Additions had been made at various points, creating an asymmetrical but functional design that prioritized utility over architectural harmony. Surrounding the house were various outbuildings, storage structures with corrugated metal roofs that gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light, equipment sheds containing the machinery and tools necessary for agricultural operations, and the workers' quarters that would serve as Maria and Eduardo's home for the next 3 months. The workers' quarters was a simple structure, built from the same adobe brick as the main house, but smaller and more utilitarian. The property was surrounded by a fence that had been constructed and repaired multiple times, its posts showing various stages of weathering and replacement. Beyond the fence, the field stretched out in all directions, geometric patterns of cultivation visible even in the pre-dawn darkness. "Come," Rodrigo instructed, gesturing for them to follow. "Isabella has prepared breakfast. You cannot work on an empty stomach." They walked toward the farmhouse, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The lantern light bobbed ahead of them, creating an almost dreamlike quality to the journey. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, as if protesting the early hour or perhaps announcing the approaching dawn. The farmhouse kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the aroma of cooking food and wood smoke. A large wood-burning stove dominated one corner, its surface covered with pots and pans in various stages of cooking. The walls were painted a warm cream color, decorated with religious icons and family photographs spanning decades. The photographs told a visual history of the family: Rodrigo and Isabella on their wedding day, their children at various ages, grandchildren playing in the fields. Isabella, Rodrigo's wife, was a woman of approximately the same age as her husband, her face bearing the lines of a life lived outdoors and in service to others. Her hair, mostly gray, was braided and pinned on top of her head in a style that suggested both practicality and cultural tradition. She moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times, her movements economical and purposeful. She had prepared an enormous spread, fresh bread still warm from the oven, eggs prepared multiple ways, scrambled, fried, incorporated into a tortilla-like dish, beans cooked with herbs and spices, cheese that appeared to be homemade, fresh fruit including papayas and bananas, and strong coffee that seemed to promise energy and clarity. "Eat well," Isabella instructed, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to ensuring others' welfare and understanding the connection between proper nutrition and successful labor. "The work ahead is demanding. Your body needs fuel. Do not be shy. There is plenty." She stood near the table, watching them eat with the satisfaction of someone performing a sacred duty. Her presence was comforting, maternal in a way that transcended biological relationship. Maria and Eduardo ate with focused intensity, understanding that this meal represented more than simple nutrition. It was a ritual, a preparation, a moment of communion before entering into shared labor. The food tasted extraordinary. The bread was dense and flavorful. The eggs were seasoned with herbs Eduardo couldn't identify. The beans had a richness that suggested hours of slow cooking. Rodrigo ate sparingly, his mind already engaged with the day's tasks and the challenges that awaited. He pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches, and began explaining the day's objectives. "We'll start in the northern section," he explained, pointing toward a map he had sketched on the back of an old envelope. The map was crude but functional, showing the various sections of the farm with notations about crop types and conditions. "This is where the flooding occurred most severely. We need to assess the damage, determine which plants can be salvaged, and begin harvesting what we can. The work is urgent because weather forecasts suggest additional rain within the next week." He looked at each of them in turn, making sure they understood the stakes. His eyes were penetrating, assessing their readiness and commitment. "The northern section covers approximately 8 hectares, he continued. "Under normal circumstances, this would take a crew of 8 workers approximately 5 days to harvest. We are 3 people. This means we have approximately 2 weeks to complete this section before moving to other areas. After that, we move to the central and southern sections, which were less severely affected but still require attention." He paused, allowing the implications to settle into their consciousness. "The mathematics are simple but unforgiving," he concluded. "We must work efficiently and consistently. There is no room for error or laziness." Eduardo's analytical mind began calculating. 8 hectares, 3 workers, 14 days. The mathematics were daunting. The work would be intense, unrelenting, physically demanding in ways his urban body had never experienced. He had worked in offices, manipulating numbers and data, but never had he engaged in labor that demanded such direct physical exertion. "What exactly will we be doing?" Eduardo asked, needing clarity and specific instructions. His need for detailed information was a remnant of his urban professional training, where understanding procedures and protocols was essential to successful performance. Rodrigo stood and gestured for them to follow. They exited the farmhouse into the gradually brightening morning. The farm revealed itself in increasing detail as dawn progressed. The field stretched out in geometric patterns, rows of crops organized with mathematical precision. The organization was impressive. Each section planted with specific crops, the rows aligned with careful attention to irrigation and sunlight exposure. Irrigation channels ran between the sections, some filled with water that reflected the pre-dawn light like mirrors, others dry and waiting for water to be directed into them. The scale of the operation was larger than Eduardo had imagined during his initial conversation with Rodrigo. What had seemed like a manageable farm suddenly appeared as a complex agricultural enterprise requiring significant coordination and labor. "We harvest by hand," Rodrigo explained as they walked, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining fundamental principles. "Each plant is evaluated individually. If it shows disease, rot, or irreversible flood damage, it's discarded. If it's salvageable, we harvest the crop carefully, place it in baskets, and transport it to the sorting area." He stopped at the edge of the northern section, and they could see the evidence of the flooding. Some plants appeared relatively normal, their leaves green and robust, their stems standing upright with apparent vitality. Other plants bore obvious signs of water damage. leaves discolored from brown to black, stems weakened and drooping. The overall appearance of vegetation pushed beyond its natural tolerance for moisture. This section will require approximately 3 to 4 weeks of intensive work, Rodrigo continued, his voice carrying the weight of realistic assessment. After that, we moved to other sections that were less severely affected. But this northern section is the priority because it's the most damaged and the most time-sensitive. He pointed toward various areas, indicating the extent of the damage and the varying degrees of plant survival. Maria stepped forward, examining the plants more closely. She knelt beside one of the more severely damaged specimens, running her fingers over the leaves with the kind of tactile sensitivity that suggested she was reading information through her fingertips. She checked the soil, pressing it between her palms to assess its moisture content and composition, observing how it held together or crumbled. "The soil is still waterlogged," she observed, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who understood plant biology through lived experience rather than formal education. "This will affect root development even in plants that appear superficially healthy. We need to be careful about which ones we salvage. Some may look acceptable now, but will deteriorate within days because their root systems are compromised." Rodrigo nodded approvingly, clearly pleased by her analysis. "Exactly. Your knowledge is valuable. This kind of assessment is what separates efficient harvesting from wasteful harvesting." He spent the next 30 minutes explaining the specific techniques for harvesting each crop type. Some crops required cutting at specific points on the stem. Others needed to be pulled from the earth carefully to preserve the roots for potential replanting. Some could be harvested more aggressively, while others required delicate handling to prevent bruising or damage. As the sun continued to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, transforming the landscape from the mysterious pre-dawn darkness into recognizable agricultural reality, Rodrigo distributed work implements, baskets for collecting harvested crops, woven from flexible branches and capable of holding substantial quantities of produce. Cutting tools, machetes, and pruning shears for separating plants from the earth or removing damaged portions. Gloves for protecting hands from rough vegetation and potential thorns or irritants. The tools themselves were well maintained, but showing signs of age and extensive use. The machetes had been sharpened countless times, their blades worn thin from years of use. The baskets were patched and repaired, their original color long since faded beneath years of exposure to sun and moisture. "We begin," Rodrigo announced, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and necessity. "Work steadily but carefully. Take brief breaks for water. Hydration is critical in this climate. We'll return to the house for lunch at midday, work for another 4 hours, then conclude for the day at sunset." He pointed toward a large water container positioned at the edge of the field, filled with fresh water and covered to keep it clean. "Drink when you're thirsty," he instructed. "Do not wait until you're desperately thirsty. By that point, your body is already beginning to suffer from dehydration." And so began the work. The first hour was almost manageable. Eduardo's body, despite its urban conditioning, responded to the demands with a kind of adrenaline-fueled determination. His hands, unused to manual labor, quickly developed blisters beneath the protective gloves. The friction between skin and fabric, combined with the pressure of gripping tools and handling rough vegetation, created small pockets of pain that gradually intensified. His back, accustomed to sitting at desks and in vehicles, protested the constant bending and lifting. The muscles along his spine complained with a dull ache that gradually sharpened as the hour progressed. His legs, used to walking on flat urban surfaces, struggled with the uneven terrain of the field, where the ground was sometimes soft and yielding, sometimes hard and compacted. Maria moved with practiced efficiency, her body having been trained by years of agricultural labor to perform these tasks with minimal wasted motion. She worked methodically, examining each plant, making quick decisions about salvageability, harvesting with precision that minimized waste and damage. Her movements were economical, each action flowing smoothly into the next, creating a rhythm that suggested deep familiarity with the work. Rodrigo worked alongside them, not directing from a distance, but participating fully in the labor. His movements were even more economical than Maria's, the result of decades of physical conditioning and repetitive practice. He worked steadily, without apparent strain, though Eduardo could see the concentration in his expression, the focus required to maintain such consistent effort over extended periods. By the second hour, the novelty had worn off completely. Eduardo's muscles began to complain more insistently. The blisters on his hands became painful, each movement of his fingers sending sharp signals of discomfort. The sun, now fully risen, beat down with increasing intensity. The morning's coolness had given way to genuine heat, and the temperature continued to climb as the sun moved higher in the sky. Sweat soaked through his shirt, creating dark patches under his arms and across his chest. His breathing became labored as he struggled to maintain the pace set by his two companions. The physical exertion required to bend, cut, lift, and carry was far more demanding than he had anticipated. His body, which had seemed reasonably healthy during his urban life, was revealing itself to be profoundly deconditioned for this type of work. His mind began to generate doubts and recriminations. Why had he agreed to this? What had he been thinking? His body was not designed for this kind of labor. He should have remained in the city, should have pursued other employment options, should have... Maria noticed his struggle and approached during a brief water break. She moved with a kind of grace that suggested she had barely exerted herself during the past 2 hours, though Eduardo knew intellectually that she must have been working as hard as he was. "The pain will decrease," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated knowledge. "Your body will adapt. The first day is always the most difficult because your muscles are shocked by demands they've never experienced. By the 3rd or 4th day, you'll begin to find a rhythm." "How do you know this?" Eduardo asked, genuinely curious about her experience and seeking some reassurance that what she was saying was true. "I've worked since I was 8 years old," Maria replied simply, her tone matter of fact. "I've experienced this transition many times. I've also watched others experience it. The ones who survive the first week usually adapt and become valuable workers." There was something in her tone that suggested she was speaking from hard-won knowledge, from witnessing both success and failure in agricultural labor. She had seen workers arrive full of hope and determination, only to disappear after a few days when the reality of the work exceeded their expectations. She had also seen workers like herself, who had been born to this life, who had learned to find meaning and rhythm in the repetitive physical demands. "The key is to not think too much," she continued. "If you focus on the pain and the difficulty, it overwhelms you. Instead, focus on the rhythm of the work. Find the pattern, the flow, the meditation that comes from repetitive motion." Eduardo tried to follow her advice, but the pain and exhaustion made meditation seem like an impossible luxury. He returned to the work, attempting to find some kind of rhythm, some way to make his body move more efficiently. By midday, Eduardo felt as though he had been working for weeks rather than hours. His entire body ached with a comprehensive pain that seemed to involve every muscle and joint. His hands were raw despite the gloves, the blisters having burst and begun to bleed slightly, creating a sticky discomfort as his palms moved against the tool handles. His mind felt foggy, overwhelmed by the relentless physical demands and the heat that seemed to press down from above like a physical weight. They returned to the farmhouse for lunch, and Isabella had prepared another substantial meal. Rice cooked with vegetables and herbs, grilled chicken seasoned with spices that made Eduardo's mouth water despite his exhaustion. Fresh vegetables including squash and peppers, more bread, and fresh fruit juice made from oranges that had apparently been squeezed that morning. The food tasted extraordinary, each flavor intensified by physical exhaustion and genuine hunger. Eduardo's body seemed to know that it needed this fuel and consumed the meal with an intensity that surprised him. He ate more than he normally would, understanding at some instinctive level that his body required substantial nutrition to continue functioning at the level demanded by agricultural labor. "You're doing well," Rodrigo said to Eduardo, observing his struggle with the kind eye of someone who understood the difficulty of adaptation. "The first day is always the hardest. Tomorrow will be easier." Eduardo wasn't entirely convinced, but he appreciated the encouragement. The older man's assessment carried weight because it came from someone who had clearly experienced this process before, who had watched others struggle and adapt. The afternoon session was somehow more difficult than the morning, despite the midday rest and the substantial meal. Eduardo's body had begun to rebel more seriously against the demands. His movements became less efficient, requiring more effort to accomplish the same tasks. His mind wandered, seeking escape from the relentless physical reality. His concentration began to slip. He made mistakes, cutting plants incorrectly, placing damaged produce in the basket with salvageable items, moving inefficiently through the field. Rodrigo corrected him gently, without criticism, simply redirecting his efforts toward more efficient approaches. The heat seemed to intensify as the afternoon progressed. The sun moved directly overhead, eliminating the slanted shadows of morning and creating an environment of nearly uniform brightness and heat. Eduardo's shirt was soaked with sweat. His hat, which he had purchased at the same market where he bought his work clothes, seemed inadequate protection against the intensity of the sun. But he persisted. Something in him refused to surrender, refused to validate the doubt that whispered in the back of his consciousness. He had been discarded by the urban economic system, deemed obsolete and unnecessary. He would not be discarded again. He would prove his worth through labor, through commitment, through the simple act of continuing despite pain and exhaustion. Maria worked beside him, occasionally offering quiet guidance or encouragement. When she noticed him making mistakes, she would demonstrate the correct technique, her movements precise and efficient. When she saw him struggling with pain or exhaustion, she would offer a word of encouragement, a reminder that this difficult moment would pass. Rodrigo maintained his steady pace, neither rushing nor slowing, simply continuing with the kind of consistency that suggested he could maintain this level of effort indefinitely. He was a machine of agricultural labor, his body having been trained through decades of repetitive work to perform these tasks with minimal conscious thought. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Eduardo began to lose track of time, existing only in the immediate moment of the task before him. Cut, harvest, place in basket, move to next plant. Cut, harvest, place in basket, move to next plant. The rhythm became hypnotic, almost meditative, despite the pain and exhaustion when sunset finally arrived, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold and deep purple, transforming the landscape into something almost unreal in its beauty. Rodrigo called an end to the day's work. Eduardo felt a wave of relief, so intense it was almost overwhelming. His body was pushed to its limits, trembling with exhaustion. They walked back to the farmhouse slowly, their pace reduced to a shuffle. Eduardo's legs felt as though they belonged to someone else, responding to his commands with a kind of sluggish reluctance. His hands throbbed with pain. His back felt as though it had been beaten with clubs. Every muscle seemed to be sending signals of protest. They returned to the farmhouse for the evening meal. Isabella had prepared soup made from vegetables and beans, fresh bread, and fruit. The food was simpler than lunch, but no less nourishing. It seemed designed specifically for workers who were too exhausted to handle heavy meals, but who still required substantial nutrition. Eduardo ate mechanically, his body consuming the food with an urgency that transcended conscious thought. The soup was warm and comforting, seeming to soothe his aching muscles from the inside out. "You'll sleep well tonight," Isabella said to Eduardo with a knowing smile. Physical exhaustion is a gift. It silences the mind and allows the body to repair itself. Tomorrow, you will feel the soreness, but by the third or fourth day, your body will begin to adapt. Eduardo was shown to the workers' quarters by Rodrigo, a simple but clean room with a bed, a small table, and a window overlooking the fields. The room was sparse but comfortable, clearly designed for temporary occupants who needed basic shelter and rest. He collapsed onto the bed without undressing, sleep claiming him almost instantly, his consciousness fading before his head fully settled on the pillow. His dreams were filled with images of harvested crops and endless rows of plants stretching toward an infinite horizon. In his dreams, he was both exhausted and transcendent, suffering and transformed, destroyed and reborn, through the simple act of labor. His body, despite its pain and exhaustion, began the process of adaptation during sleep. Muscles would repair themselves, becoming stronger in response to demands they had never experienced. His mind, despite its doubts and fears, would gradually accept the reality of his new life. By morning, though the pain would be significant, Eduardo would have crossed a threshold from which there was no return.